So I made a torpedo build, and historically torpedo builds haven't really done that well on the channel, but largely because back then they were largely the same. I never really varied up the theme a little bit, but this time this torpedo build is a bit different because it's less focused on the meta and more focused on stuffing as many torpedoes on it as I possibly can. And by that I don't just mean the weapons, I mean also in the consoles and in the starship traits and wherever else I can get them on. Now I just need to think of a better name for it, because I've been calling it my all-torpedo build, and that's not really catchy. So something like the torpedo barrage build or something like that, I guess. I don't know. Augie's better with names, so let's just get on with it. Okay, let's take a look and see just how much torpedo stuff I can fit onto just one build. It was actually quite a bit more than I thought. I decided to do this build on the legendary Akira. After spending so much time over the past couple of years saying that the legendary Akira has to be a torpedo build because, canonically, it is the only Star Trek ship in Starfleet that is a torpedo boat because it has like 16 torpedo tubes, it seemed the most appropriate. Or at the very least the most fun for me. Though if I'm being honest, there are a couple ships that I think would actually perform better with this theme, and I'll go over those later, but yeah, I just decided to do this on the legendary Akira because I felt like it. Starting off in the weapons, if you've seen some of my past torpedo builds, you're going to see some familiar items here. The Enhanced Biomolecular Photon Torpedo from the 8472 reputation, the Delphic Distortion Torpedo from the Lobi store, the Neutronic Torpedo from the Delta reputation, and the Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo from the Discovery Legends reputation. These have been part of the DPS meta for ages now, and while this build isn't focused on getting maximum amount of DPS, I didn't feel like stepping away from that entirely either. I did consider switching it up a bit, like going with all Kelvin torpedoes because they have such a low cooldown they'd be firing off so rapidly. I also thought about going with just standard photons and or quantums to go with a sort of Canon Akira look. But with all the traits and consoles in here as well, there are going to be a bunch of different projectiles, all with their own visuals and sound effects, so I didn't see the problem with having a mixture of different torpedoes. I've also included the Maelstrom torpedo, which comes off of this ship, the legendary Akira. While this torpedo did get nerfed a while back, they did buff it again, so it's not quite back to its original standing, but it's still very much still worth using. In fact, I actually put two on this build, because this is meant to be an all-torpedo build. I didn't want to put mines on it, so I just put more torpedoes in the back, one of which is a Maelstrom torpedo, just in case I can try to get an extra hit out of that at full charge. And the other two are the Prolonged Photon Torpedo, which you can get in the Phoenix Prize store these days, and the Wide-Angle Quantum Torpedo, which comes with any C-store versions of the Sovereign class. These two are here because they are wide-angle torpedoes, so I'm going to have a much wider firing arc with these than standard torpedoes. With their wider firing arc, I can get some use out of these while I'm moving around the map, because the forward weapons are still going to be very forward-facing. I did consider putting one more wide-angle torpedo in the back, the wide-angle Advanced Inhibiting Chronoton Torpedo from the Gamma reputation, again just because it would be one more wide-angle torpedo for the back, but I decided to go with the Maelstrom just in the hopes of being able to get one more hit out of that at full charge. But you might find a third wide-angle torpedo in the back to be more useful instead. There's also the various missile launchers in the game, like the Kantari missile launcher, the Ferengi missile, or the Spatial Torpedo from the Lobi store. Those also have 180-degree arcs, and they also have much faster cooldowns, but they look very different from actual torpedoes. They look like, well, missiles. This was meant to be an all-torpedo build, so I wanted to stick with just torpedoes. In the core gear is, again, a lot of familiar stuff. We got the Protomatter Deflector from the Draenor Colony for the buffs to crit chance and crit severity, the Competitive Reputation Impulse Engine for the speed buffs, though if you don't like the sudden burst in speed, you can go with the Advanced Romulan Prototype Engine from the Romulan Reputation instead, because that also gives crit severity. For the Warp Core, I've actually been using the Tholian Nucleating Warp Core from the Crystal Harmonics set. I've been using this core a lot lately because every time you destroy an enemy, it drops a little warp crystal, and anytime an enemy runs into that warp crystal, it'll deal radiation damage, so it's basically a warp core that drops a bunch of little mines. I know I said mines really aren't part of the build, but I do find this to be a useful function. It's also nice because when you or friendly targets running into those crystals will get secondary shields, so it's a little helpful for survivability. Alternatively, you can go with the Revolutionary Warp Core to get some more crit severity, or you can go with the Discovery Reputation Warp Core, because I am also using the Discovery Reputation Shield, and then you get the 2-piece bonus, which gives some extra hull regeneration. Okay, in the devices, I'm pretty spoiled for choice because this is a cruiser leveled up to T6X2, so we've got 6 device slots. So that's the Advanced Kinetic Amplifiers, Deuterium Surplus, Reactive Armor Catalyst, the Kobayashi Maru Transponder, the Temporal Negotiator, and just for fun, the Flagship Distress Frequency Transponder. Now onto the consoles, and this is where stuff gets kind of interesting, because there are a lot of consoles that just fire torpedoes as an effect. This first one is the VAQ Warhead Multiple Launch System, which comes off of the Texas class. It stores up to 12 charges, each one of those being a torpedo. Clicking it will fire all the charges you have, and each of those torpedoes will function kind of like a heavy plasma torpedo, so they'll be large and slow, and if the target that they're going after is destroyed, they'll seek out another target. But if they've been flying for long enough, they will split into 6 smaller torpedoes and then rush at one single target. So each larger torpedo is kind of like a cluster torpedo. But if you fire them close enough, the larger torpedo will hit your target instead. It's not the most powerful console in the build, but we're really going for quantity over quality here, and this certainly fits that theme. Next is the Genesis Seed off the Clark Command Multi-Mission Cruiser. Now, I'll admit this one is kind of a stretch for the theme of the build because, well, it's the Genesis device, it forms a planet that then explodes in your enemy's face. But at the same time, the device does fire out of your ship kind of like a torpedo does, and you could argue that a planet is just a giant torpedo. Like I said, it's a bit of a stretch thematically, but it's a fun console, so I felt like keeping it on. Next is the Torpedo Points Defense System, which I think is off of the Tier 3 version of the Akira. I think that's a Thunderchild. It's also available on the Legendary Akira, obviously. But yeah, obviously this console was going to be included here because all this thing does is just fire torpedoes in every single freaking direction. And for an old console, it actually does some pretty decent damage on a torpedo build because it deals kinetic damage, and all you're doing on a torpedo build is buffing your kinetic damage. The Point Defense Bombardment Warhead off of the NX Refit and the Legendary NX. It's a big torpedo that fires a bunch of smaller torpedoes until the big one explodes. So yeah, obviously this is going to be on a torpedo build. Opening Salvo off the Titan Science Destroyer. It fires several salvos of torpedoes at up to 5 different targets, dealing kinetic damage and knocking one subsystem offline for up to 6 seconds. Multi-directional Artillery Barrage off the Lexington. This functions a little bit like the Torpedo Point Defense System in that it will fire torpedoes in every direction. This console will also gain bonus damage depending on how many targets you hit with it, and in how many of your targeting arcs they're in. In the next row, first we've got Tricobalt Terra Launcher, which is off of the Appalachia Blockade Runner. It fires 5 heavy Tricobalt torpedoes, which will deal kinetic damage, and those Tricobalts will also leave behind some unstable subspace rifts, which will deal additional kinetic damage over time. The other one is External Massive Munition Hardpoints off of the Cabot Command Light Escort. This one can hold up to 2 charges, each of which fires a Quantum Warhead. When that warhead hits an enemy, it'll create a cone of damage that will deal some additional damage behind the enemy, hitting up to 3 additional targets. And in the tactical consoles, most of these are actually more here for utility purposes rather than firing additional torpedoes. First is the Covert Warhead module off the Eagle Pilot Raider. This one is here more for its passive than anything else, which reduces the shared cooldown of your torpedoes down to 1.5 seconds, down from 2 seconds. Ferrofluidic Assembly from the Terran Reputation effectively does the same thing, but their effects don't stack, so it's kind of one or the other. And the Warhead module has a better passive projectile damage buff, and its clicky gives me an enhanced battle cloak. More than that, while the cloak is active, this console will drop explosives onto nearby targets. So yeah, obviously I'm going to pick this over the Ferrofluidic. The rest of these are just passive consoles, the first one being Lorca's Custom Fire Control for its buff to crit chance and its shield pen buff. Also the 2-piece bonus because I am using this along with the Dark Matter Quantum Torpedo, which is a stacking buff to crit severity. And the other 3 are Vulnerability Locators and Exploiters to buff my crit chance and crit severity, along with torpedo damage. Now, there are 2 other consoles that I would have liked to be able to include onto this build, but I just don't have the means to do it right now. One of which I went over pretty recently. The JDMA launch cells off of the Dauntless 2. I don't have that console yet because, as of recording this, the Dauntless 2 isn't even out yet. But also because I really can't afford to buy another lockbox ship right now because I just spent a bunch of EC buying the Texas class so I can get its console for this build as well. So yeah, that one's going to have to wait a while if I ever decide to get it at all. The other is Enhanced Shrapnel Torpedo Launcher off the Tal Shiar Adapted Destroyer, which again is another lockbox ship. Both of these fire multiple torpedoes and would be perfect for the theme of this build, but again, I can't afford them, and honestly, I really don't know if I have room for them. Both in my console slots and in my power tray, I have really stuffed this thing to the brim with universal consoles. That said, I'd certainly still want to try, but again, there's still the first issue of not being able to afford them. Okay, let's move off of the consoles because I still have the hangar bay to go over, in which I have the Elite Valkyrie Fighter Squadron. Now, for this build, I was more concerned about creating torpedoes from my own ship rather than from various pets, but it is nice that these pets do also fit the theme of the build because they are fighter pets that can use Torpedo High Yield 3 and Torpedo Spread 3. So that's more torpedoes than you're going to get from most pets. Alternatively, you could go with Scorpion fighter pets because they do have those high yield plasma torpedoes. Now, before moving on, I also want to go over some experimental weapons. Obviously, I didn't use any on this build because I have it on a cruiser, but there's nothing to stop you from running this on an escort as well. In fact, it might actually perform better on an escort, like the Eagle or the Dalkina. Now, if you're going to be running this off the Eagle or anything else with an enhanced battle cloak, I would recommend using the Eagle's experimental weapon, Subspace Depth Charge. While this weapon doesn't function like a torpedo, and in fact it actually deals Tetrion damage, it is actually capable of firing while an enhanced battle cloak is active, much like a torpedo does. So this experimental weapon can be really useful in that sort of instance. But of course there are other more torpedo-themed options, like the VAQ Warhead Individual Launch System of the Texas, the Terran Repeating Warhead Launcher off of the Adamant, or the Experimental Dual Warhead Launcher off the Miradorn Pilot Raider. Of those three, the one from the Adamant is probably the best one, though I haven't had a chance to test out the one off the Texas that closely yet, though I would bet that the Adamant's experimental would probably do better. I don't own the Miradorn ship, so I've never been able to play around with its experimental weapon, but I've heard its DPS really isn't that great, so I would probably just go with one of the other two. Okay, the skill specializations. Again, no different from my usual stuff. I've got Intel Officer as my primary to gain access to space flanking, which gives me some extra bonus damage when firing on an enemy's rear arc, and Temporal as my secondary to gain access to Entropic Rider, which adds some physical damage to my weapons. I know plenty of people still prefer to use Strategist as their secondary, which that's fine. I just don't like Strategist because it doesn't have any ground skills, and I always feel kinda under-equipped if I'm ever going into any ground TFOs. Anyway, moving on to the traits. I'm not going to go over every single personal trait just because there's a lot of stuff here I use on pretty much every build, but any of the personal traits that I don't go over will be listed on the screen, so you'll at least know the names. So, of the personal traits that I'm using specifically for this build, first is Superior Projectile Training, which this one's obvious, it buffs projectile damage. Resonating Payload Modification, which gives a stacking debuff to physical and kinetic damage resistance. Self-Modulating Fire, which gives my weapons a buff to shield penetration every time I score a critical hit. Veruvian Explosives, which give a 15% chance for one of my kinetic damage weapons to deal an additional 40% damage as radiation damage. And the last one I'm going to go over is called Rogue Scientist on Board. Now, this one's a little weird. Every 60 seconds, this personal trait will randomly activate one of the following abilities. Emergency Power to Shields 1, Attack Pattern Omega 1, or Photon Torpedo Spread 1. This is actually the only personal trait I could find that actually gives additional torpedoes. Everything else is just a buff to your existing torpedoes in one way or another. But that Photon Torpedo Spread it gives, it doesn't apply as a firing mode to your existing torpedoes, it just fires its own torpedoes as a torpedo spread. Meaning they don't do that much damage, and you don't get them that often because you only have a 1 in 3 chance of them even triggering every 1 minute, but it's still additional torpedoes that you wouldn't have had before. And I've also got other things on here that can be triggered by the other abilities that this thing is generating. More on that in a bit. Now, moving on to the Starship traits. First is Ceaseless Momentum of the Nokjedge Intel Battlecruiser. This one gives me a bit of a bonus damage buff to my kinetic damage, but also reduces the recharge time of my torpedoes by 1 second, meaning I'll be able to get them off cooldown that much quicker. Next is Entwined Tactical Matrices of the Gagarin and Kuj Miracle Worker Battlecruisers. This thing has been part of the torpedo meta for ages now. Whenever I activate Fire at Will or Cannon Scatter Volley, I get a free hit of Torpedo Spread 1. So that means I can get that many extra torpedo spreads, which is way better than just firing one single torpedo. Next is Rapid Emitting Armaments off of the legendary Dideridex. Every time I activate Tractor Beam, I get a bonus damage buff to my torpedo damage, and it'll fire 3 heavy plasma torpedoes at the foe I'm targeting. That happens every time you activate Tractor Beam. Those heavy plasma torpedoes are very powerful. Assault Formation Theta off of the legendary Talis. Anytime I activate Attack Pattern Omega or deactivate a cloaking device, I get a free hit of Torpedo High Yield 3 and a buff to my crit severity and my turn rate. Now, not only will this trigger off of the Attack Pattern Omega from Rogue Scientist on board, but it'll also trigger when I deactivate the Enhanced Battle Cloak from Covert Warhead module. Now, on this build specifically that I'm running right now, this trait really isn't that great. Yes, I am able to trigger it every once in a while thanks to that personal trait and that console, but this thing would function a lot better if I had an actual Battle Cloak, or better yet, if I actually had room for Attack Pattern Omega. So this trait is another example of why this build would probably function better on an escort. Next is Automated Aggression of the Zentaur. Every time I activate a tactical or bridge officer ability, I shoot out a little protomatter barrage, which will deal kinetic and radiation damage in a 1 kilometer radius. This one's a pretty decent trait, and it's one of those rare ones that fires off its own projectiles, but it does kind of throw me off aesthetically because they don't look like, normal torpedoes, they look more like missiles actually, which does bug me a little bit, but not enough to not use it, because like I said, this is a good trait, and it certainly does still fit the theme. The next trait is Torpedo Barrage off of the Alachi Sheshar Dreadnought. Anytime I activate a Torpedo High Yield attack, I will gain an additional Torpedo High Yield 1. This would be a very nice trait except for the fact that it has a 30-second cooldown. It's not necessarily a terrible trait either, but I do wish that cooldown was lower. But regardless, some additional high yields is still very much fitting to the theme of this build of maximizing the number of torpedoes that I can shoot out of my ship. Also, shout out to my buddy JB over at Pirates Scum Gaming for gifting me the Cheshire so I would be able to use its trait on this build. Wouldn't have been able to do that otherwise because the Cheshire is a promo ship. So, thank you very much JB, and to the rest of you, be sure to go follow Pirates Scum Gaming over on Twitch. The last starship trait on here is subspatial warheads off of the Sona Intel Battlecruiser. Anytime I hit a target with torpedo high yield, it'll create a subspatial rift, which will deal some physical damage and follow around the target a little bit. With how many high yields I'm able to fire off of this build, that is going to be a lot of subspatial rifts, and the damage these things do can really add up. While this one doesn't really fit with the theme of creating additional torpedoes for the build, it does create additional entities off of those torpedo high yields. So at the very least I figured it was thematically adjacent. And honestly, this is another one that's just too powerful to give up. There are a couple of other starship traits that I feel like are worth talking about for the sake of this theme, but I decided not to use. The first is Stealth Torpedo Bomber off of the Eagle Pilot Raider. This one will build up stacks while you're cloaked or every time you use pilot maneuvers, and when you get to 10 stacks you get a free hit of Torpedo Spread 2. This is a really nice trait, however I do not have pilot maneuvers on this ship because obviously it's not a pilot ship, and I don't have a true cloaking device, just the one given to me by Covert Warhead Module. Now if I was using a ship that had its own enhanced battle cloak, like the Eagle, or the legendary Talus, or the legendary Bortosk, then I definitely would have used this starship trait. Another one I feel obligated to mention is Black Alert off of the Crossfield. Black Alert does give some extra photon torpedo spreads, kind of like Rogue Scientist on board does, meaning that it just fires off its own torpedo spread, it doesn't apply the ability to your own torpedoes. But Black Alert will only trigger when activating Beam Overload, Cannon Rapid Fire, or an Intel Bridge Officer ability. Obviously I'm not using the first two on a torpedo build, and the legendary Akira doesn't have Intel seating. And the last trait I want to talk about is Target That Explosion, which comes off of the Earhart, the Setch, and the legendary Excelsior. After activating a Torpedo or Command Bridge Officer ability, your next torpedo that deals damage will trigger up to 6 allies to also fire an additional torpedo. Now the main reason I didn't use this trait is because I was more concerned with generating torpedoes from my own ship rather than nearby ships. Also because this trait really just isn't that powerful. But I wouldn't deny that this trait does fit the theme of creating as many torpedoes as possible. In fact, it even fits for this ship because it does have a hangar base, so that is a potential for 6 additional allies right there. Moving on to the bridge officers, a lot of this is pretty typical, but I did make a few changes that I wouldn't normally make. We'll start with the tactical seating because most of that's pretty obvious. Chemosite-laced weaponry adds some radiation damage to my weapons. It's only a 10% chance to trigger out of energy weapons, but it's guaranteed on any torpedo. Scatter Volley 1 and Fire at Will 1 to trigger Entwined Tactical Matrices. And High Yield 3 to buff my torpedoes. In the engineering/command seat, I've got emergency power to engines, though honestly I'm thinking about trading that out for Let It Go, because Let It Go fires out as these two little orbs, and you could argue that they are torpedo-esque. Let It Go also deals some cold damage and gives a damage resistance debuff, so it's kinda nice. Emit Unstable Warp Bubble to trigger unconventional systems, Concentrate Firepower for the extra high yield ones, and Call Emergency Artillery because this deals kinetic damage, and because it's a torpedo build I'm already buffing kinetic damage a lot, so these two synergize really well. Plus I love having Call Emergency Artillery on the Akira specifically because they're always Defiant class ships on a Fed character, so it's kind of like recreating that scene in Message in a Bottle where that Akira class and the 2 Defiants go in to save the Prometheus from the Romulans, except in this case it's 3 Defiants, but you know what, I'm not going to say no to an extra Defiant. And in the science seating we've got Gem Sensors and Scramble Sensors, those are there to trigger unconventional systems. Tractor Beam also triggers that, along with Rapid Emitting Armaments. Gravity Well also triggers Uncon, and it's just a really useful ability. And down here in this ensign seat is something I rarely ever use, and that's a heal ability. That's Hazard Emitters. Yeah, I know. Who am I? What have I done with Stu? But the reason I'm using this here is because I am also using the Dr. Crusher Bridge Officer, who has the unique Bridge Officer trait A Lot's Happened in the Last 20 Years. On activating a Shield or Hull Repair Bridge Officer ability, it grants me a Torpedo High Yield 1. So with that Hazard Emitters, I can get yet another Torpedo High Yield. Now this will also trigger from the emergency power to shields that I'm getting from Rogue Scientist on board, but like I said, that trait has a long cooldown and it only has a 1 in 3 chance of getting that ability, so I didn't want to hedge all my bets on that. And plus I've kind of maxed out the number of unconventional systems triggers I can get out of my science seating, at least not without setting off any shared cooldowns. Before this I was using Destabilized Warp Core in that seat. It doesn't do much for the torpedo theme, but I like the idea of having an extra explosion after I destroy something. And it's a Miracle Worker ability, so it was one more thing for automated aggression to trigger off of. So I could feasibly still go back to that. For the duty officers, now honestly I didn't do much variation here. A lot of this is still my usual expensive Borg duty officers and expensive crit chance and crit severity duty officers. though I did put in one projectile officer that has a chance to reduce the cooldown of my torpedoes. So if you're operating on more of a budget, I would just get 3 of these cooldown guys. Now let's look at the combat log for this thing. In the 9th World Patrol on Elite, I only managed to get 240k out of this thing, which honestly is a bit lower than I expected, but honestly I really shouldn't be that surprised because I did have to make some compromises on this thing. For one, no mines, so I was getting next to no use out of my aft weapons because there's no such thing as an omnidirectional torpedo, and plus I'm not really able to use Assault Formation Theta to its fullest potential because my only attack pattern Omega is coming from a personal trait, and my only cloak is coming from a console ability. I also didn't use the Tholian Warp Core in this test. I've gone over this before, using the Tholian Warp Core kind of skews results in this map because they all just sit there at the spawn point and it becomes kind of unfair. I also got a little overwhelmed at the end and there was one death, so that's also going to hurt my DPS output. That said, the build didn't do bad. I mean, you look at the DPS output of a lot of the individual stuff and there's some pretty good results here. Like, we got 65k out of the pets, we got nearly 30k out of just the Maelstrom out of Torp Spread 1. Some of these I do wish had done better, but honestly I think some of it is just me being a little out of practice with torpedo builds. Like, I feel like my timing with the Maelstrom and a couple of the consoles could have been better. I've gotten so accustomed to fire at will these days, I'm forgetting how to do everything else, I guess. But in the end, this is just meant to be a goofy theme build, so as long as it can still perform reasonably well in Elite, which it is, I'm pretty happy. Now, I wanted to give you guys a proper demonstration of this build in action, so I also ran it through Wanted on Elite. So I'm going to play that now before we get into the outro.
Looks like our fight got them to notice us.
So yeah, that is my torpedo barrage build, where I stuff as many torpedoes onto one build as I possibly can. Like I said before, this thing is more focused on quantity more than quality, so it's not going to be breaking any DPS records probably, but at the same time, it doesn't hold back either. It certainly still packs a punch, but that's largely just because, you know, torpedoes. That's kind of what they do in Star Trek Online. So yeah, let me know what you think down in the comments below, and while you're down there, let me know if I missed anything, because I did a pretty good job, I think, of going through the various consoles and starship traits, but I kind of skimmed over like the lower tier consoles, so, you know, beyond the Akira set console, I kind of skimmed over the rest of them. I don't think there's much else I could have added. Oh, maybe there's like the that one from the old Constitution, but God, that thing is not a good console. I don't think I would have included that anyway, but at the same time, yeah, let me know what other consoles you think I could have included on this, or traits or Doffs or anything else. And yeah, while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or hit the super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store in the video's description. If you're ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. It doesn't cost you anything extra, but it does help me out, and I do appreciate that. That is Epic creator code STU1701. Either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.